Good evening. I'm Allison Schilling, Senior Program Officer at the Concord Museum. Tonight's forum is part of a series of spring forums connected to our new temporary exhibit, Alive with Birds, William Brewster in Concord, which opened last week and was curated in partnership with Mass Audubon. William Brewster was a noted ornithologist at Harvard University and the first president of Mass Audubon. Other events in the speaker series include forums in March with Helen McDonald, Scott Edwards, and Terry Tempest Williams. Lastly, as part of the Concord Museum's literary offerings, next week the museum features a virtual conversation with novelist Ann Patchett. And in April, for National Poetry Month, a virtual reading by former poet laureate of the United States, Billy Collins. To learn more about upcoming events, please visit the museum's website. And a reminder that if you have questions during tonight's forum, you can submit those in the chat on YouTube, and we will get to as many as possible. It is now my pleasure to introduce the Executive Director of Mass Audubon, David O'Neill.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first forum in a series of events co-sponsored by the Concord Museum and Mass Audubon in connection, again, with the new exhibit, Alive with Birds, William Brewster in Concord. I hope those of you who have not viewed the new exhibit will come out soon and visit it. We could not imagine a better person to open this series than Elizabeth Kolbert, a staff writer for The New Yorker. Her newest book flows quite naturally from her two previous volumes. In 2006, she published Field Notes from a Catastrophe, in which she chronicled the onslaught of climate change. In 2014, she won the Pulitzer Prize for The Sixth Extinction in Unnatural History, in which she details the crushing of biodiversity beneath the human footprint. Reviewing that book in the New York Times, Mushiku Kukutani observed, Elizabeth Kolbert writes with elegiac poetry about the vanishing creatures of this planet, but the real power of the book resides in the hard science and historical context she delivers, documenting the mounting losses that human beings are leaving in their wake. Her newest book, Under the White Sky, The Future of Nature, examines the question of whether humanity can be trusted to repair the environmental damage that we ourselves have caused. The book mixes travelogue, science reporting, explanatory journalism, writes reviewer Carlos Lozada, all with the authority of a writer confident enough to acknowledge ambiguity. As she asks the question, can we change nature, this time to save it? Before turning things over to Tom, on behalf of the board and the 140,000 members of Mass Audubon, let me say a word of personal appreciation to Elizabeth Kolbert. Tom.
Thanks, David. And Elizabeth, thank you so much for taking the time to join us this evening as we discuss your newest book. I have a sense that some of our viewers may not be as familiar with your past work. So first, I've watched some interviews you've done, and I'm struck that unlike someone, say, like Rachel Carson, who came to her writing as a scientist who then discovered her voice as an author, you really are a writer who then came to discover this question of climate change. So maybe you could just give our viewers a brief history of your own career and what led you to write on this topic.
Sure. First, just let me thank David for that very generous introduction, and thanks for having me tonight, and thanks to everyone who's here tonight. I started out, I am a journalist. I've through my whole professional life and adult life, I've been a journalist. I started out as a copy person, what used to be called a copy person at the New York Times, and I kind of worked my way up through the Times to become a reporter, and I covered politics mostly at the New York Times, New York politics. And then I went to the New Yorker to also cover politics, to write a column about New York City politics. But for a bunch of reasons, some of which had to do with the state of New York politics, some of which had to do with the news cycle, some of which had to do with personal inclination, I sort of pivoted at a certain point and decided to try to write about climate change. And once again, for a series of complicated reasons, that became a series on climate change in 2005. And as I'm sure a lot of people in the audience can relate to, once you sort of start thinking about climate change and exploring it, it tends to sort of take over your life. And so that's sort of what happened to me. It started out as a single journalistic project, and it just sort of, to use a bad pun, snowballed from there.
And we could spend the whole hour speaking about your past book, The Sixth Extinction, but I think it is helpful to just explain the title of that book, because it really leads to the new book.
So, The Sixth Extinction, it's pretty, on some level, it's pretty clear that there have been 5 mass extinctions before, what are called major mass extinctions in the history of multicellular life. So we're talking about roughly 500 million years of multicellular life. And, most of these extinctions are not lost, but, they're not everyday topics of conversation. The worst of them occurred about 250 million years ago at the end of the Permian period. It's the end of the Paleozoic era, and it was a really, really almost extinguished multicellular life. So that was a huge crisis in the history of life. The most recent and most familiar of these mass extinction events is, of course, the event that took out the dinosaurs about 66 million years ago. And there's a pretty broad consensus now that was caused by an asteroid impact. And so, to say that we're in the 6th extinction or on the verge of the 6th extinction, which I don't think is in scientific circles a terribly controversial statement, is obviously to make a pretty big claim. But as I say, unfortunately, tragically, not a very controversial one.
And you write that in essence, we are the asteroid this time, that what we are doing to our environment could cause this mass extinction. Could you just briefly introduce the term Anthropocene, or some people say Anthropocene, and what you mean by that term?
Yes, so both pronunciations, the Americans tend to say Anthropocene and the Brits say Anthropocene. So, technically we live in a geological epoch called the Holocene, and that's the period roughly 12,000 years since the end of the last ice age. So, 12,000 years ago, Massachusetts was under ice, and the signs of that ice age are all around us in the erratics and in the markings on the rocks. And so to say that we're in a new geological epoch, in this case, the Anthropocene, named for human impacts, is also, once again, it's a big claim, but once again, one that is not terribly controversial right now. I mean, human impacts, people who have looked at this question really from a very rigorous scientific standpoint, like, will the geologists of the future, we look back on the past through what's left in the rock after tens and even hundreds of millions of years, will our impacts be visible tens or hundreds of millions of years from now? And the very stark conclusion is yes. What we are doing is so dramatic. And when you start to think about the ways that we're altering the world, they are very, very dramatic. Just the amount of land now that's, for example, given over to monocultures, that will show up as a pollen record that will last for a very, very, very long time. And it will be clear that something very strange was going on in this moment that we count as the present. In your new book, you cite a quote that's been attributed to Albert Einstein, but it isn't really known whether Albert Einstein said it. We can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. But again, this is the intriguing question that you try to tackle in this new book of essays.
or as you write, it's a book about people trying to solve problems created by people who are trying to solve problems. So let's quickly sample a few of these topics. I always kind of warn our viewers that my approach is to kind of like nibbling at pieces of chocolate in a large collection. We won't delve all the way in, but we hope we whet your appetite to buy the book or get it out from your library and sample them more thoroughly. So I thought we might actually start with the book, with the essay from which the title of the book comes, but I'll hold off and have you explain the title a little bit later. I watched an interesting program you did with C-SPAN, and you were very brave in taking live questions from callers. And of course, you handled them very well, but I kind of held my breath a few times as the skeptics called. And one of the skeptics, one of their arguments is they point to this eruption in 1815 of a volcano called Mount Tambora. You write about that in this essay. Just maybe explain to the audience what this argument is and then why it doesn't really hold. I mean, the volcano did erupt, but anyway, go ahead and talk about Tambora.
Well, Tambora was a very, very major eruption. It was, there's a scale of volcanic activity, and it is, the only eruption of its magnitude in recorded history. And it was, witnessed by many people. And many people perished immediately as a result of Mount Tambora, as a result of the pyroclastic cloud that came down, just seared, fried people. And then many people died pretty quickly because their crops had been covered with ash, and there was famine. But the effect that was really very well chronicled was this volcano put a tremendous amount of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, and sulfur dioxide in the stratosphere forms these little droplets. They're very reflective, so you get these beautiful sunsets, and you get cooler temperatures because there's actually less direct sunlight hitting the earth. It's being bounced back to space, as a fraction of it. And this caused what became known as the year without a summer. It was called 1800 and froze to death. And there are records from all over, the records from Vermont, the records from here in Williamstown of frosts in the middle of August that killed the crops. It was a really devastating event. It was a devastating event in Europe as well, a very terrible weather that caused tremendous starvation. And so it's estimated that, many millions of people died, suffered from malnutrition, emigrated as a result of the eruption of Mount Tambora.
And I'll just let you take it from here. So you use that to kind of introduce this new notion of geoengineering and explain what the notion is here and how that would help protect us from global warming.
So what's called solar geoengineering, or sometimes referred to as solar radiation management, which sounds sort of more benign, is this idea that we would mimic volcanoes. So we know that volcanoes, major eruptions, they really have to be quite major, and they have to loft material all the way into the stratosphere. But we know that when that happens, as with Mount Tambora, and also we have more recent records from Mount Pinatubo, which was very carefully studied precisely for this reason. We could do that theoretically. Once again, I say in theory, we could, loft airplanes into the stratosphere, release reflective particles, some kind of reflective particles. It could be sulfur dioxide. We could just go the volcano route, or we could design something, people argue, some kind of particle that would reflect sunlight. It would get spread globally through these stratospheric winds. It would stay aloft roughly on the timescale that volcanic eruptions, the products that volcanic eruptions do, which is a year or two. You'd have to keep replenishing this stuff. But once again, in theory, you could cool the planet and offset some or even all, although that would be, models suggest, pretty dangerous to do. of the effects of dumping a lot of carbon dioxide into the air. So this is sort of the ultimate, example of the phenomenon that I am exploring in Under a White Sky, where humans intervene in nature in some way, either purposefully or, in the case of climate change, actually inadvertently. And then we reach for some other intervention that's going to save us from the effects of our first intervention.
And maybe explain the book's title, how it emanates from this theory.
Yeah, well, if you did this, if you threw a lot of reflective particles into the stratosphere, you would change the tint of the sky. It would become, not actually white, but whitish, so that if you were even out in a part of the world that right now where you'd see a very blue sky, you would see a whitish haze, the way you do if you're in New York City, to be honest. So that it would look like that everywhere.
So you've somewhat said how it would continually need to be replenished, but talk about the negative, the fears of this, and you quote a potential outcome known as termination shock. What could happen?
Well, there's a million things that could happen, and people keep lists of sort of the potentially very dangerous effects of doing this, and they range from changing the color of the sky, which could have psychic consequences, I suppose, to altering the monsoons, the Asian monsoons, in ways that could cause mass starvation. Termination shock refers to the idea that, and interestingly enough, I think it's a pretty big seller right now. There's a book out right now called Termination Shock, a sci-fi book, which I have to confess I haven't read yet, but I should. So if you put this stuff up, this reflective particles, and you mask some of the effects of climate change, then if you stopped doing that, you would get this very sudden run up in temperatures as all of that sort of climate change that you'd been, sort of suppressing in a way, I don't know exactly what verb to use here, suddenly manifested itself. So that is what termination shock is. And people argue that sudden run up in temperatures would be very dangerous, which it would be. And I think it does, having a war on right now, I think is very sobering, because, this regime of constantly replenishing these particles does seem to sort of imagine a world, interestingly enough, that is at peace, and where we're sort of cooperating and we're keeping this project going for quite a long time. I mean, we're talking about timescales of, certainly decades, maybe centuries. And then when you get a good old fashioned war going, you wonder, well, is that really among the many other reasons to be concerned about this prospect is the possibility that this world order is not really ever very stable.
So many of the essays have this general theme of unintended consequences. I thought we'd switch maybe to the first essay in the book, where you summarize the essay with this one short sentence. First, you reverse a river, then you electrify it. So let's untangle that sentence and explain what river, when, and why was its direction reversed.
So the river that was reversed is the Chicago River, which I'm sure most people in the audience tonight have probably seen at one point or another. It's the river that runs right through the center of Chicago. It's the river that they dye green every St. Patrick's Day. And it is why Chicago is where it is. It was very useful to have it. It's not a big river, as rivers go, but it flows into Lake Michigan, or it used to flow into Lake Michigan. And so from the founding of Chicago in the very early part of the 19th century through the end of the 19th century, Chicago dumped all of its waste, and that included the huge amounts of waste, the viscera and guts from the stockyards, and its human waste. All of it went into the Chicago River, which was just basically a sewer. And it was said that the river was so thick with filth that a chicken could walk across it without ever getting her feet wet. And by the end of the 19th century, it was clear that this was, dangerous, that you could not keep dumping your sewage into your drinking water. So Chicago got the great idea, or kind of amazing idea, that they were going to reverse the flow of the Chicago River. And that they did with a project that was one of the biggest engineering projects of its time. This is prior to the construction of the Panama Canal. And it was a massive project. You can go online and find pictures of this equipment building this canal that they needed to reverse the flow of the Chicago River.
Which led to a different unintended consequence concerning Asian carp. Maybe you can explain what happened.
Yeah, so, decades passed. What happened when they reversed the flow of the Chicago River, which they certainly knew they were doing, but didn't think much about, was that they had to connect the Chicago River to the Mississippi River system, to which it had not been connected. It was part of a different drainage system, the Great Lakes drainage system. And once you connected them, you now had this way for aquatic creatures, to pass from one drainage system to the other. And this was not a terribly big deal throughout the 20th century, most of the 20th century, in part because the canal was still so polluted that probably not much could get through. And in part because we had not yet done things like build the St. Lawrence Seaway, which brought a tremendous number of invasive species into the Great Lakes. So both the Mississippi water system and the Great Lakes water system, and particularly the Great Lakes, are very invaded water bodies. They've just been the ecosystem has been completely devastated by one round of invasive species after the other. So towards the end of the 20th century, there was actually a fish making its way from the Great Lakes into the Mississippi, and the Congress decided, it was called the round goby. Congress decided, well, we don't really want the round goby in the Mississippi water system. So please, Army Corps of Engineers, please come up with a way to keep it out. By the time the Army Corps of Engineers got its act together, the round goby already was in the Mississippi. So it was too late for that. But meanwhile, another fish, or really four species of fish that are collectively known as Asian carp, were working their way up towards the Great Lakes. And this became a source of real panic, because Asian carp are incredibly effective invaders. They've really taken over a lot of the Mississippi River system. They have a lot of bad habits, as it were. And so they decided, well, we need to really work to keep the Asian carp out of the Great Lakes, so from going in the opposite direction. And what the Army Corps of Engineers came up with was this electric barrier. So if you go down the Chicago River now, what's now down river, you eventually come to this stretch of the river that's where a lot of electricity is being pulsed into the water. And there are huge signs. I went there. It was kind of a cool trip. It's not a trip that a lot of people make. It's not very scenic. And there are these huge signs that say, don't go into the water. Keep your animals and your kids in the boat because you'll get electrocuted. So that is the story of the river that was reversed and is now electrified.
There's an irony here. I referenced Rachel Carson earlier, but it was partly her book, Silent Spring, that led to the introduction of Asian carp into the United States. Maybe explain, not in this area, but into American waters. Maybe explain how that happened.
Yeah, it is a pretty interesting story. So Rachel Carson, was very down, and rightly so, on all of the chemicals that we were pouring on the land and in the water, herbicides, to kill off things that we didn't want, agricultural pests, aquatic weeds. And so after Silent Spring came out, and at the end of Silent Spring, for those of you who haven't read it recently, there's a whole chapter on this notion of biocontrol, that we should actually try to set one pest species basically against another pest species. And that's the way you keep things in check, rather than, dumping a lot of chemicals on them. And unfortunately, people took that, also to places that it shouldn't have gone. Biocontrol is very, chancy. You bring in a new species, even if it's to control a species you don't want, you're taking a lot of risks. And a lot of things were done throughout history and that hopefully would not be done now, bringing one species into control another species. And so Asian carp, all these 4 species, they have different eating habits. They were all brought in to do different things. One was brought in, it was going to eat algae, it was going to reduce the nutrient load from sewage. One was going to eat aquatic weeds. One was going to eat snails that spread disease in aquaculture. Anyway, so these 4 species that can really eat sort of up and down the food chain were brought into these experimental ponds and immediately got loose and just had to prove themselves to be extremely, extremely successful invaders. Now we are seeing here, nowadays, I think I think that we are a lot more cautious, still not as cautious as we should be in terms of purposefully introducing species, but that has been overtaken in a lot of ways by global trade, which is now bringing in invasive species at an astonishing rate. And, we in New England here now are seeing, emerald ash borer move through, completely devastate the forests of New England. So that these waves of species of introduced species are really still wreaking havoc, even though in many cases they have not been purposefully introduced these days.
We don't have to go into it. You also write about how some of the carp are flying carp, so they actually fly out of the water and are dangerous to fishermen. And a point you make a few times in the book is that, and it's a pretty obvious one, but that instead of changing ourselves, our behaviors, and our bad habits, we seek to adapt the environment. Instead of stopping the pollution of Chicago's water system, they changed the direction of the Chicago River, or in your words, it was easier to imagine changing the river than changing the lives of the people around it. It's a theme that kind of runs throughout the book, that we don't want to change our behaviors. We look for these technological fixes to allow us to continue to do the things that we want to do.
Yeah, and I think that is not an impulse, that I applaud in the book, but I think if you look around, you kind of have to acknowledge that that's true. We have, for example, with climate change, we are not just reluctant or adamantly refuse to do the things that are, we know need to be done. And therefore, either explicitly or implicitly are kind of hoping for some technology. And even when we do talk about, changing things, it's always with some new technology that's going to somehow allow us to continue to do sort of exactly what we're doing. We won't have gasoline powered cars, we'll have electric cars. When I think that a pretty strong argument can be made, that the problem is much deeper than that.
Let's switch to the essay about the devil's hole pupfish, which you say may well be the rarest fish in the world. Again, you traveled to see them. So what are they? What do they look like? And where are they located?
The devil's hole pupfish it's about an inch long. It's a very beautiful fish, very bright blue, sort of iridescent blue. And they're called pupfish because they're sort of playful and they chase each other like, little puppies. And the devil's hole pupfish, there are many species of pupfish, lives only in Devil's Hole, which is a cavern basically in the middle of the Mojave. Really in an astonishingly, brutal landscape. And then you sort of stumble onto this hole in the rock, and at the bottom of this little cavern is this beautiful pool, which is actually the emanation or where this very, very extensive underground aquifer comes to the surface in this one strange spot. And it was, it's sort of a mystical spot. It was considered, sort of mystical by the native people who lived in the area. And the Devil's Hole pupfish, which I think is probably the rarest fish in the world, though it's impossible to really know that for sure, lives only in this one pool in the Mojave, which is a pretty weird thing, a desert fish, although there are many desert fish, it turns out. And one of the things that's interesting about it, there are many things that are interesting about the Devil's Hole pupfish. One of the things that's interesting about it is that the water in this pool is heated geothermally. So it's 93 degrees. That's very warm. Most fish would, die instantaneously if you toss them in there. It has very low oxygen. The Devil's Hole pupfish lives there and only there. And it sort of seems to require these very brutal conditions. And you'd think it was incredibly tough, which on some level it is. But as soon as people started pumping water out of this aquifer, and the level of Devil's Hole started to drop, the number of the fish started to plummet, and they've really never recovered.
You use that to say, well, why don't you say first what we have done to help them survive? I'll use a quote from your book that we've created another class of animal. The term for such creatures is conservation reliant, though they might also be called Stockholm species for their utter dependence on their persecutors. So tell us what we have done to try to save the Devil's Hole pupfish.
Well, over the years, people realized that the pumping of the water out of Devil's Hole began in the 60s, and it was actually a case that reached the Supreme Court. And to show you what a different country this was, the court voted 9-0 basically in favor of the pupfish, that the pupfish had to be given enough water to survive. Now, by that point, it was already in some sense too late to prevent the water level from dropping. It had already dropped, it has not recovered, but they couldn't keep pumping out of that aquifer. And it's kind of frightening and depressing to think what would happen if that case reached the Supreme Court now. But as soon as people realized that these fish were having trouble, they tried all sorts of things. They fed them. There was a bank of lights was installed to give them more, light, and all sorts of complicated jury-rigged things. And eventually they just decided, when the numbers got really, really brutally low, about 15 years ago, maybe, they decided they were going to have to build a whole new cavern for them. So they built this sort of backup cavern about a mile away. It's completely fake, but it's been designed to imitate the original as closely as possible. Everything is monitored down to the 100th of a degree, and the pH of the water and the oxygenation of the water, to create these brutal conditions for these fish in this fake cavern.
You don't quite address this in the book. One of the nice things about your essays is you let the reader come to their own conclusion. But again, in that C-SPAN interview, I heard you answer the question: why should we care? Why should we want, as a species, to preserve the Devil's Hole pupfish? Why should we spend this money to do that?
Well, I think there are a lot of reasons, a lot of possible ways to answer that. One reason, and I'll give you the actual reason, that this money has been spent, is because that's the way the Endangered Species Act works. You get listed, and the Devil's Hole pupfish was one of the very first animals to be listed under the Endangered Species Act, and the Fish and Wildlife Service, the federal government, is basically required to come up with a plan to save you from extinction. And that requires having more than one population. So the Devil's Hole pupfish, in a sense, could have been listed even before these destroyed their habitat. They only have one population, and that's very risky, obviously. And they will never get off the endangered species list. But so that is the sort of explanation for why this money has been spent. But if you want to go farther and explore the sort of ethical issues, I think that there's a very strong case to be made, that we don't really have, that we have an ethical obligation to not obliterate other species. How's that? It's sort of a negative obligation to not obliterate them. Now, obviously we are obliterating them, all the time without even noticing, probably in a lot of cases, and their backlog to get on the endangered species list is huge. Basically now, some organization has to sue on your behalf or you're not going to get onto the list because there's such a huge list now. And then if you also say, well, I still don't care. I don't believe in the ethical obligation. I don't believe in the legal obligation. There's one more argument, which I guess you can try out, which is, we don't know really what species we depend on. It's probably pretty unlikely that it's the devil hole's pupfish, but we are connected to, through vast chains and food webs, many, many other species. And we don't really know which are the ones that when they wink out, ecosystems and ecosystem services, a terrible phrase that I actually hate, but I will use here, that we depend on, are also going to wink out. So it's sort of an insurance policy to say, well, if things are that bad, that these other species are dying off, we might want to take a look at that situation and not let that happen.
One of the delightful things about your book are often these fun turns of phrases, and there's some dark comedy. Maybe I've written them down, but maybe I'll let you do the punchline. I mean, you actually estimate the entire population of Devil's Hole pupfish and compare what, if you put them all together, what they would weigh as much as.
Yeah, I think it was McDonald's fillet of fish or something, McFish or something. Yeah, I looked up that figure. It's very tiny. Yeah.
Right. You also talk at one point about how food is brought in for these fish. So we deliver supplemental meals and brine shrimp to Devil's Hole, which you describe as Grubhub for fish. But anyway, your writing style just makes what are very kind of dire stories wonderfully engaging to read. Let's turn to the I want to remind our viewers that if you'd like to ask questions, I'm happy to relay them to Elizabeth Kolbert, so just use the chat feature. Let's turn to the essay on coral reefs, which are imperiled for many reasons, but especially spiking water temperatures and increasingly acidic seas. Why don't you just, for a minute, you open that talking about a scientist who's since passed away, Ruth Gates, but tell us a little bit about her and why she was such a remarkable person that you write about in a remarkable way.
So Ruth was as a biologist, marine biologist. She ran the Hawaiian Marine Biological Institute, and she had this idea. She came up with this idea, and it was and is still pretty controversial. I mean, reefs, as you mentioned, are just in really bad shape. Coral reefs. So coral reefs are created by these tiny little animals, gelatinous animals that have these plants, even tinier little plants living inside their cells, and that actually provide them a lot of the energy they need to build reefs, which is a very energy sort of intensive process. And as water temperatures spike, this relationship, this symbiotic relationship, is endangered. And that is this phenomenon called coral bleaching, which I'm sure everyone has heard about. And Ruth was sort of looking out at the oceans, which, are going to continue to warm under really any plausible scenario, and thinking, well, we can't just give up on reefs. We can't just, sort of throw up our hands and say, well, they're just gonna wink out. They're too important. They're incredibly important ecosystems for the health of our oceans. And so she had this idea, well, can we create a more resilient reef basically by breeding up these corals that are tougher, that are heat tolerant, more heat tolerant. And that project continues to this day, and has produced, some corals in the lab. And I think some of them have actually been sort of, transplanted onto reefs, although in a very, very, very limited way, do show some more resilience than their counterparts. But the question of, how practical that approach is for reefs, the Great Barrier Reef, for example, has an area the size of Italy. So how much, human intervention can accomplish is an open question. Excuse me.
You refer to this as assisted evolution, or scientists refer to it as assisted evolution. And in some ways, I don't know if it's the exact opposite of the pupfish, but it's kind of tackling this question in a different way, rather than trying to protect the environment in which the coral reefs grow. It's trying to help them to be more resilient. Just talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is another example, and all of these stories, in the book are really examples of ways in which, once again, we're trying to intervene again. In the case of the pupfish, we're intervening by building them fake habitat, and fake habitat is actually, all too common these days, I'm afraid. It happens a lot that you take all of the animals that still exist of a species that you can get and put them into some captive breeding facility and try to imitate their actual habitat to get them to breed. And then other ways of looking at things are, okay, well, we can't bring all the corals into captivity. Let's try to change the corals. And that brings us pretty quickly. This project, Ruth's project, was not using gene editing, but you do get very quickly to gene editing. If you could gene edit corals, let's say, to be more, with a certain heat tolerance gene, then perhaps you could really create and propagate, a more heat tolerant coral. So while they're not doing that, I do also talk in the book about projects where people are trying to use gene editing to create creatures or plants that will be able to withstand the conditions that we're throwing at them.
A couple of quotes about Ruth Gates. She gets a $4 million grant to create this super coral, and one of her graduate students actually puts a big S on some coral as like Superman. Her quote is, "I'm a realist. I cannot continue to hope that our planet is not going to change radically. It's already changed. So people can either assist corals in coping with that change or watch them die." And you describe her as a glass half full type of person. And then in somewhat contrast, you say that you arrive with a notebook full of doubt. What's that like to meet these? There are many scientists who you admire for their work and their, using their intellectual abilities and time and talents to try to solve these problems. And yet you arrive somewhat as the skeptical journalist. Just talk about that a little bit.
Well, I think that, people expect that from journalists. So, Ruth was a very dynamic, charismatic person. And she, did not, it wasn't like I was telling her anything, honestly, that she hadn't heard from a lot of people. I mean, if you have a vision for doing something, of the ambition and scale that Ruth was talking about, you're going to get a lot of pushback. And she had gotten a lot of pushback from a lot of her colleagues who just said this was, kind of quixotic, really. And so it wasn't like, as I say, it wasn't like she hadn't heard it all before, and she had very cogent answers to it. And her answer was basically, you got any better ideas? What are we going to do? And a lot of coral biologists would say, well, unless we stop carbon emissions, ASAP, we're going to lose reefs. And so we should be putting all of our effort into stopping carbon emissions. And Ruth's attitude, which unfortunately you can call it more realistic or less realistic, it's hard to say, was, well, we're not stopping carbon emissions. Okay, so what are we going to do? And she was trying to sort of push a more, I guess you'd call it a somewhat more hopeful vision, like that there was still something you could do even as we cross some of these temperature thresholds that many other coral biologists were saying were just not survivable. So, it remains very, very much an open question whether any of these, as I said, any of these interventions will actually work. But I think that you're going to see more and more of them. The Australian government is putting a lot of money into them, in part because of the reality that carbon emissions are not, stopping anytime soon, and in part, honestly, out of a somewhat cynical view that the Australians are big coal exporters, and they're not really keen on just saying, well, we're not going to export any more coal. So you could argue that they and we all are, trying to have our cake and eat it too, continuing to do these things and saying, oh, but there is a solution out there somewhere.
I'll admit that not every one of our forum ends with a wild sex scene, so this is the first one. But you traveled to Australia to witness what you called coral sex, which is a rare and amazing sight. Explain to us what you witnessed there.
in order to do these, this work that they were doing, and this project was taking place. Ruth was in Hawaii, and she had a counterpart, a woman named Madeline von Oppen, who's in Australia. And even after Ruth very tragically died in 2018, the project continues both in Hawaii and in Australia. So I went to Australia to see what's known as the spawning, and it takes place basically once a year. They're somewhat different nights for different species, but you can time it pretty well. You know when it's going to be. It's after a full moon in our fall, and what happens is that these corals, which are many species are hermaphroditic basically, and they produce these little beads. They look like pink glass beads that contain sperm and eggs, and they release them all remarkably similar time. They just all start to float up, and it's an amazing sight. And when I was watching this experiment, the corals were spawning in buckets, and they were scooping up all of these eggs and sperm, and they were going to use them to cross fertilize and create these hybrid corals. But I was actually also on the Great Barrier Reef a while ago, 2010 or so, 2009. And I saw the spawning out on the reef, actually snorkeled through a spawning event. And that was a truly remarkable experience to watch, really millions and millions of these little beads rising through the water and a lot of things come to feed on them, and a lot of iridescent creatures. It's quite phenomenal.
I'll just read another fun quote from the book. As you're all waiting for this to happen, as the sun went down, more and more people started to arrive. So as to not interfere with the light regime, everyone was wearing special red tinted headlamps that gave off a lurid glow that seemed appropriate, since what the crowd had come to watch was, we all hoped, an orgy. Anyhow, it's a fun part of that essay. So I have a couple final questions. Early in our conversation, I referenced Rachel Carson, who wrote for The New Yorker, and I'm sure you are friends and colleagues with Bill McKibben, who also writes for The New Yorker. And you note at one point, Rachel Carson was somewhat prescriptive in her writing about what she felt the solutions were, and certainly Bill McKibben is known to be a strong activist. It must be tempting at times for you to follow that model, but one senses you've resisted that and stayed true to your core as being a journalist. But what's that conversation that you have with yourself about being a journalist versus being an activist?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. And I guess some people would claim that I have, abandoned journalistic objectivity. And I think I do think about it and I do wrestle with it. And should I be on the barricades as opposed to behind my computer? I think, part of my reluctance is I'm not really I don't think I'm a very good activist. But part of it is also I'm not exactly sure what I'm advocating on behalf of. These are such huge and complicated issues, and they don't have they're not amenable to easy answers. And so I don't have, people often ask me like, what is the answer? And I say, like, if I had the answer, I would not be here. I would be, king of the world, basically. I mean, these are really, really, climate change has been called a super wicked problem. It's not just a wicked problem, it's a super wicked problem for a variety of reasons that have to do with, the distributed nature of the impacts, the time lag in the impacts. There's all sorts of reasons why we are not focusing on it, even though it is becoming an increasingly acute problem. Even then, we seem to manage to sort of ignore it.
This is a question that's in the same vein, but you referenced earlier that you were a former political reporter, and yet it seems you've made a conscious decision in these essays to stick with the science. We had a forum recently with E.O. Wilson's biographer, Richard Rhodes, and I wanted to quote Ed Wilson, who said that we as a species have Paleolithic brains, medieval institutions, and space age technologies. And I always like to make connections between our forums. So last fall, we had an interesting forum with Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer, and we had one with former US Ambassador to the United Nations, Samantha Power. And I greatly admire those two individuals, but I left both with the sense that these institutions, the Supreme Court in one case, the United Nations in another, just aren't capable of tackling the problems that they are medieval institutions for 21st century problems. So I just wonder if, it's a whole nother realm, of a whole nother book to think about the politics of all this, but do you venture in that direction, or anyway, how do you grapple with that question?
Well, that Ed Wilson quote that you just gave is one of my favorite quotes. I think it really, really sums it up in a lot of ways. And I think that precisely one of the reasons there's so much, excitement and hope and around, these technological fixes is because we are much better. We have space age technology. We're really good at technology. We're really pretty bad at social organization and social change. And that gets back to, not doing what we know we need to do as a society. And we see that on, so many issues right now. So it's very hard to have faith. You don't even have to go as far as the UN. You could, go to the state capitol in Boston and say, are they doing what they know they should be doing? And the answer is no. And so at all levels, at pretty much all levels, from the local to the international, we say, well, people just aren't great at this. Let's hope that there's some technology that saves us, because we're not going to save ourselves. And that is, as I say, that's kind of the message of the book, to be honest, obviously, is, well, that's a bet that that you're putting a lot on that bet. How's that? Would you bet a planet on that?
I'm asking the same question, almost in different forms. This is my last question, then I just have a final word. So I know you wish to leave it with your readers, but I can't resist asking you the overarching question. So in the end, do you find yourself being more of a techno-optimist or a techno-fatalist? Or after all of your reporting, is the brave new world we are entering more exciting or terrifying to you?
Well, I'm definitely not a techno-optimist, but I do have to acknowledge, as it were, and I'll just leave with one, story. it's, roughly a century ago, a little bit more than a century ago, people, were really, really worried that the world was facing starvation because we were going to run out of nitrogen. We didn't have enough nitrogen fertilizer to fertilize our crops. We'd run through every possible source of nitrogen, all this guano. We'd, scraped all this guano off of these islands. We'd just gone through everything. And, just in the nick of time, as it were, and you can go back and find very dire predictions. Fritz, Haber, a German scientist, invented this process for creating, synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, and that has not just, sort of saved humanity. That's responsible for probably roughly half of the population on the planet today. So, amazing things do happen. People do make amazing breakthroughs that seem impossible. So I think it is important to keep open that possibility, but I also think it's important to say, that just because that has happened doesn't mean it's going to perpetually happen.
So we're a history museum. First, I wanted to note that you quote Henry David Thoreau a number of times in the book. So those of us here in Concord, for whom he's a hometown hero, are happy to read that. So I wanted to end with a couple of historical quotes that you reference in the book. The first is from Charles Darwin, who I wish we had had more time to discuss tonight, but he plays a role in the book. Darwin wrote, "There's a grandeur in this view of life in which endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved." And the second, from Henry David Thoreau in the 1850s, he wrote about the extirpation from New England of moose, cougar, beavers, and wolverines, and queried, "Is it not a maimed and imperfect nature that I am conversant with?" And in another essay, you also quote Thoreau asking, "Who hears the fishes when they cry?" It might be said that we do, Elizabeth Kolbert, or at least we come as close as we can in hearing them due to your thoughtful reporting. So we thank you very much for writing this book, for your utterly original examination of the challenges we face facing our planet today, and most of all for being here with us this evening. So thank you so very much.
Oh, well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
And I'll just thank everyone for tuning in. And as Allison mentioned, join us next Wednesday night for a conversation with Ann Patchett on her new collection of essays. And then 2 weeks from tonight for a forum with Helen McDonald on her new collection of essays, Vesper Flights. Thank you again for tuning in, and good night.